Welcome to Subramani. Today I'm going to talk to you about a person who has built a nice portfolio over a long period of time. She started investing when she was about 23 years of age. She had just finished her MBA and she had taken up a job, and she is a HR professional, and now she must be about 33, and she's unmarried. She earns very well. I would think about 30-35 lakhs is her surplus available after paying all taxes, which is not a bad sum of money for a professional who is on her own. She's now quit all her jobs and she's doing HR consulting. She came to me with a very longish portfolio. She is a friend's sister, so she came to me with a longish portfolio and said, look, I have this long portfolio, which she has put it on a website, and she sent me the login password, and I found she had close to 60-65 stocks. She has equity, direct equity, she has mutual funds, she has ETF, and she has put about 28-30 lakhs in PMS. This was put earlier, and so it has now changed in value, and therefore it is about 35 lakhs maybe, which she wants to continue. So one advantage is I asked her to put her portfolio in a place where there could be overlap which is visible. She knows there is overlap, and she thought that she would be able to handle the overlap with, by selling something and all that, but she hadn't come to it. So she has invested in 13 or 14 mutual funds, equity mutual funds. She has 60-70 stocks, and she has a PMS. Now imagine the total portfolio is not worth more than about 2 crores, and that is spread over, if you add up all of it together, in 100 plus stocks. If you consider all the shares, all the equity which is embedded in the mutual fund schemes and the ETFs. Now she wanted to know how to reduce this over diversification which she has done. She accepts she has done over diversification, and even today she talks to somebody and some share looks good, she goes and buys it. I mean, when you have 100 shares, how much justification can you do to a portfolio? So I said you have to come down to 12 or 13 shares, and which is like shocking for her, because she thought diversification helps. And diversification surely helps, but over diversification does not help. So she had to concentrate her portfolio by selling off a bit, and that was not easy for her. But because this was such a largely diversified portfolio, even her biggest holdings were not very big, they were quite tiny. So I said something dramatic and simple for her, is to say, I put a lot of her money into equity index funds, because she was not going to pay much attention to her portfolio, even though she pretended that she knew how to pick shares. So I asked her how she picked shares. She said, oh, if somebody told me about a company, I would go and check the PE. If the PE was high, I would not buy it. If the PE was low, I would buy it. And I asked her what is high and low, and she said, oh, 20 is the cutoff, because she read in some article that if the company's PE is above 20, she should not buy it, and if it is below 20, she should buy it. And she did not know the difference between a commodity stock, an IT company, which means she knew what she was doing, but she didn't know that the PE of an IT company could be much higher than that of a commodity company or something like that. So she didn't know. She just kept a standard 20 PE. So anything above 20 PE was expensive, and anything below 20 PE was not expensive. And she would buy not expensive shares. Now, obviously, she had dividend income. She had all that going, and I put some money in an Indian index fund, a developed market index fund, and that's it. That was all that she was going to invest fresh. I did not sell off all her ETF, because some were 8 months old, some were 9 months old, and some were more than 2 years old. So I had to rationalize the portfolio, and I said I will book enough profits to at least make sure that you have only about 1 lakh of taxable long-term capital gain, which meant 2 lakhs of long-term capital gain. On 1 lakh you pay some tax, on 1 lakh is tax free. So also the advantages, tax harvesting was possible because there were some shares on which she was sitting on a loss. So some of those shares could be sold and some of the capital gains to be booked. So that helped me. So now here she was in an index fund. She had an emergency fund, but emergency fund was not so important for her because her parents were well off and she could always tap on them and say, I want some money, I have a medical emergency or some other kind of emergency. So emergency fund was not so much of an issue. She was sitting on a lot of cash also, waiting for the market to crash so that she could buy. She knew about SIP, she had read about SIP, but she thought that the temptation to time the market was just too high. So whenever the market was low, she would go and put money in an ETF. I asked her how will she put money in an US fund if she thinks the US market is low, and she had no answer. She had no intentions of going for the LRS scheme. So first I made her, I considered her portfolio PMS and said, look, your PMS is not doing too well. So redeemed some of her PMS money. Redeemed a lot of her mutual funds which were not in fund houses of great favor with her. So she sold that. She sold all equity shares which had less than 50,000 in value. That itself came down from 60, 70 shares to about 38 shares or 40 shares. So about 30 shares is what she could get rid of because they did not have a particular threshold value. I said below this does not make sense at all, and all that money went into an index fund, including a developed market index fund. So that's how. Why did I do this? Because she's not a trained professional. She is an amateur. She's a HR consultant. She does some PR consulting also. Now with all this work full time, it is not going to be possible for her to devote time to do any equity research to buy equity shares. Now don't mistake me. I also don't do enough research, but I know whom to talk with, right? There is somebody who is telling me what to do with my portfolio, somebody who is a friend, philosopher, guide, broker, whatever you want to call it. All of that put together, he is helping me with whatever is happening with the fund, so with my equity portfolio. So if all that is happening with you, it's fine. Otherwise it does not make sense to have a very longish 60, 70 share, maybe 100 share portfolio if you don't know how to pay attention to it. Now don't say paying attention means looking at it on a day-to-day basis. That's not the answer. Like this girl had bought the shares because somebody had recommended something which was there in her father's portfolio, which she copied. So it was not a very great healthy looking portfolio. So some rationalization was done, and now I have told her that she should realize less money. People who are young professionals should realize that as much as possible it is they should defer their realization of income. Now you can't defer your dividends, you cannot defer your rent, but you can defer definitely by investing in a growth option of a mutual fund, which is not an ETF, a regular fund. You can postpone the dividend by 10-20 years. Like this girl had no reason to get so much of dividend. She did not need the dividend. Not that she was in a dividend intensive portfolio, but the thing is you don't need the dividend. Then you have something called a growth option. So in mutual funds you defer your taxation also, maybe by 10-15 years or 20 years, whatever, depending on your age. So has some advantages and has some disadvantages, but mutual funds or index funds was the easiest thing for her to do, because this was not a full-time profession for her. So if it's not your full-time profession and you're not going to pay enough attention or not going to pay enough attention to look after it properly, if your full-time job is that of a lawyer or a chartered accountant or a doctor, or like in her case a HR professional, why would you want to underperform the index by creating such a long portfolio? Because then there is always some tip, and it definitely feel like you can do market timing. Then there is FOMO, so you don't want to miss out on some tip that you got from a person who normally gives a good tip, right? So you are getting tempted into all those things. It's much easier to have a simple portfolio of index funds or 2-3 index funds, maybe a next Nifty, maybe in developed market index fund. Beyond that you don't need much, and you're actually not adding value. When I calculated and told her she was underperforming the index, she was quite shocked. right? So that's what happens when you put numbers, check, then you come to a more realistic strategy than just